starting pitching is dying, or at least that's what people are telling me. And I mean, it's kind of hard to disagree with them. Just look at this graph that shows the average length of a start by year. Up until around 2015, starting pitchers' average length was in a steady state around 6 innings pitched, but since 2015, we've seen a sharp and sudden decline in starting pitcher usage. Nowadays, starters are averaging closer to 5 innings per start, or roughly 4,860 less innings in total per year. That's a lot of innings. So, if we look at something like the trend in starting pitcher contracts, we would expect to see a somewhat similar pattern, right? Wrong. This is a graph that shows the average top 50 starting pitcher contracts by year. Starting pitchers are getting paid as much as they ever have, if not more in today's game, even after adjusting for inflation. That trend is roughly parallel to the growth that hitters' contracts have seen in that same time. So if starting pitchers are pitching less, and they're less valuable than they've ever been, then why are teams who want to use money as efficiently as possible still paying for them? It's because starting pitching isn't dying. It's not going anywhere. It's just changing, evolving to fit the modern game's demands, and ultimately become just as valuable as they once were. It doesn't take much to see how much pitching has changed in the past 10 to 20 years. The average fastball velocity has been climbing year over year from the start of the pitch tracking era to today, and it doesn't show any signs of slowing down. Several pitchers dominated the early 2000s without insane velocity or strikeout stuff, like Greg Maddux, Mark Buehrle, and Tim Hudson, though these kinds of pitchers don't exist anymore. These guys in the early 2000s were posting numbers like this every year, well over 200 innings pitched while having a pretty low strikeout rate compared to what we see today. Though this strategy was very effective in this era of baseball, as all of these guys were some of the top pitchers in the league at the time. In 2025, however, Logan Webb led the league with 207 innings, lower than all three of these 7-year averages. There were only 3 qualified starters in 2025 with a strikeout rate in this range: Mitchell Parker with 14.2%, Andre Palante with 15.5%, and Jake Irvin with 15.8%. This archetype of pitcher literally doesn't exist anymore. Take a look at this chart that shows the number of starters each year that averaged less than 90 miles per hour on their fastball. In 2008, that number was 45. Guess how many there were in 2025? I'll give you a second. That's right, only 3 pitchers. If you got that question right, your prize is to subscribe to the channel, as most of you watching this are not. A lot of fans see this trend and just kind of assume that the pitchers of modern day are all just wild and out of control, just trying to throw the ball as hard as they can. Though the walk rate has been roughly steady in that same time, in fact it's lower than what it was in 2008. So let's go a little deeper. The only 3 pitchers to have a sub 90 mile per hour fastball this year were Tyler Anderson, Clayton Kershaw, and of course my guy Kyle Hendricks. Hendricks was the subject of a video that I made a while ago that talked about this archetype of pitcher. Pitchers who sacrifice velocity and swing and miss stuff for better command. But not just any command around the edge of the zone. There is one thing for sure that hasn't changed with pitching in the modern game. If we divide the strike zone up into 3 sections, heart, shadow, and chase, we see a similar pattern in 2008 that we do in 2025. In 2025, plate appearances that end with a pitch in the heart of the zone had a slugging percentage of .545. In plate appearances that end with a pitch in the chase area, batters have an on-base percentage of .453, which is really high. These numbers are similar for the 2008 season, though the trade-off for both seasons is that hitters don't do damage with these pitches outside the zone, and pitches inside the heart of the zone have a much lower on-base percentage. Basically, the farther the pitch gets from the center of the zone, the harder it is to do damage with, but the closer the pitch gets to the center of the zone, the less likely it's called a ball. What's the optimal solution? Locate the pitch as far away from the center of the zone as possible where the umpire will still call it a strike, also known as the shadow zone. In this zone, you get the best of both worlds: no walks and weaker contact with less optimal launch angles. This is a strategy that was mastered by Kyle Hendricks, who's really the last remnant of this once booming pitcher archetype. Now, it's not to say guys like Mark Buehrle or Greg Maddux wouldn't be as good today, but it certainly has become much harder to pitch like this. And a lot of people seem to think that with the absence of this type of valuable pitcher, starting pitching as a whole has gotten worse. But as these types of starters are phased out, that just leaves more room for other valuable ones to come in. And one of the main reasons that these pitchers are essentially being forced out of the league is the person behind the plate. No, not the catcher, the umpire. Umpires are not perfect, obviously. Fans are frustrated with the person behind the plate more often than they're pleased with them. That mostly has to do with some cognitive bias, but also with umpire accuracy when it comes to balls and strikes. With every game you watch, though, you're theoretically watching the best umpiring you've ever seen in general. And that's not a good thing for the pitchers. This is a graph that shows the percentage of pitches that were actually outside the strike zone that were called a strike incorrectly. In 2008, that percentage was up near 30%. That means if a pitcher threw a ball outside the zone in 2008, it had a 30% chance to be called a strike. In 2025, though, that number is less than half of what it once was. The strike zone is tightening. This optimal zone that pitchers aim for is slowly being forced closer and closer to the center of the zone by more accurate and consistent umpiring. That means that these optimal pitches are in spots where more damage is done. Essentially, it's a lot more dangerous to try to paint the edges of the zone, as the modern effective strike zone is much smaller. This is just one of the many reasons why we've seen a shift in the approach from starting pitchers today. If location is something that pitchers aren't going to be able to manipulate as much anymore, then they're going to focus on the things that make pitches even in the hittable locations hard to hit. Velocity, spin rate, movement, release point, arm angle, seam orientation, tunneling, unique pitch mix, all those cool things. And when pitchers are focusing on these aspects, you get guys like Paul Skeens, Tarek Skubal, Garrett Crochet, Dylan Cease, and even the pitcher with the highest ground ball rate in the league, which is kind of a throwback thing, Jose Soriano. Also with these things come the decreased innings and the arm injuries, which we'll talk about a little more later. Let's focus on Kyle Hendricks for a second. He's made a living on locating his sinker inside to lefties and outside to righties. The pitch looks like it's going to be a ball the entire way, but at the last second, it darts right over the edge of the zone for a strike. In 2016, Hendricks often used the umpiring to his advantage, getting 46 sinkers off of this edge of the plate incorrectly called a strike. We're talking about multiple inches off the plate that are called strikes. In 2025, he only had 18 of those called strikes incorrectly. This is actually a trend we've seen league-wide. There were 11,110 total sinkers thrown off that edge of the plate in 2008. In 2025, that number has decreased to 7,054. In 2008, 2,345 of these pitches were called strikes, which was the incorrect call that massively benefited the pitcher, especially the command-heavy pitchers that like to locate on the edge of the zone. In 2025, only 1,041 of them were called strikes, far outpacing the decrease in the total amount of sinkers thrown in that area. These other pitchers that we talked about before relied on that same pitch, sinkers or other types of pitches on the edge of the zone. The umpiring, though, has lowered the effectiveness of this pitch. When you take into account this changing, also hitters are focusing more on doing damage rather than just putting the ball in play, and more optimal launch angles, the pitch to contact approach as a whole is just not effective as it once was. So in return, pitchers and teams have gone in different directions in effort to stay relevant. And when we look at these different directions, we see that starters haven't gotten less valuable, but rather just optimized their approach to fit the modern game. There are three main ways that a pitcher can define himself: get swings and misses, locate pitches in optimal spots, or generate weak contact and suboptimal launch angles, in other words, generate ground balls. These three factors have been a staple of pitching since its inception, but over time, pitchers have adapted to use each skill a little differently. With these three skills, I believe there are roughly 5 general archetypes of starters in the league today. The first being the stuff merchants, the pitchers who live and die by the swing and miss. Think of Dylan Cease, Mackenzie Gore, or Freddie Peralta. Low in-zone contact rates, high chase rates, though they may give up a few more walks than you would like. Next are the ground ballers, obviously characterized by the fact that they induce a lot of ground balls. They don't get as many outs via the strikeout. Think of Jose Soriano, Framber Valdez, and Logan Webb. Though these ground ballers are a lot different than the ground ballers of old, which we'll get into a little later. The third archetype is the commander. They may not have the best swing and miss stuff or even induce ground balls, but they locate pitches in valuable spots, leading to low walk rates and weaker contact. Think of Kyle Hendricks, Tomoyuki Sugano, and Zach Littell. These are the guys that are usually tagged as innings eaters. The last two are the unicorn category and the boring category. The unicorns are good in all three areas. They have swing and miss stuff, they locate their pitches well, and they don't give up a ton of fly balls. These are your Cy Young candidates like Paul Skeens, Tarek Skubal, and Christopher Sanchez. The boring category are the opposite, pitchers who don't stand out in any area. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're bad, but they probably aren't good. In 2025, these pitchers were pitchers like Seth Lugo, Eduardo Rodriguez, and Luis Severino. Unsurprisingly, these guys didn't post great overall numbers this year. We can visualize these three skills in this three-dimensional visualization here. The gold points are the unicorns, the red points are the stuff merchants, the blue points are the ground ballers, the green points are the commanders, and the gray points are the boring pitchers. As you can see, there are not many commanders left in today's game. These are mainly the guys that are throwing lower velocity and more of what you think of when you say a throwback type of pitcher. Most of these pitchers also didn't perform that well overall in 2025. If you want to look more into this graph yourself, you can check it out in the link in the description. Now, you might be saying that Greg Maddux and those guys that we talked about earlier would probably be classified in the ground ball archetype, and you're probably correct. Though when we look at some of the names in the new age ground baller category, they are far different from the likes of Maddux and Mark Burley. As we see in this graph, the ground ballist of all ground ballers is Jose Soriano, who I've mentioned a few times before. He by far had the highest ground ball rate in the league in 2025, though it's not like he's just flipping it over the zone, he's throwing near triple-digit fastballs. Framber Valdez is another one of these new age ground ballers, and even Logan Webb throws his fastball around the league average, not what you think of for your stereotypical ground baller. That's because in today's game, even if you want to be a pitch-to-contact, ground ball type of pitcher, you're still going to need some pretty nasty stuff. And because of these changes, the main trade-off is the quality of innings and health concerns. But for modern starters, this is a non-negotiable trade-off, as it's what all types of starting pitchers need in order to be effective. Else they'll end up in the commander category with pitchers who aren't as successful. Hitters are better than ever at elevating the ball and keeping the ball off the ground, meaning that pitchers need to be better than ever at forcing hitters to do that. Which means pitchers need to have better stuff than ever to force hitters to hit ground balls. Sure, they'll throw less innings, but innings pitched is only a single number. Just because they've decreased doesn't mean that the value is also way down. Let's look at some more numbers. If none of the things I've said so far have landed with you, this graph should. This shows the total WAR for starting pitchers and relievers for each year since 2000. One cool thing about WAR is that it's a closed system. Roughly 430 is given out to pitchers every year. So if starting pitchers were really getting less valuable, we would see that number decline as relievers took over. Though we don't really see that. In 2000, starters were worth 353 WAR in total. In 2025, they were worth 326. This is a minor decrease, and based off of all these headlines and takes, you would think the trend would be falling off a cliff, but it's certainly not. A part of this value decline is also due to the rise in the opener, as technically they get counted as the starting pitcher even though the actual starter follows that pitcher as a reliever. This is a strategic change and one that doesn't really reflect the quality of starting pitchers. Let's look at a different graph. This one from the same time span but looking at the most valuable starter per year. This is a clear decreasing trend as time goes on, and ultimately one of the main sources of the starting pitcher is dying narrative. The top starters in the league today are not quite as dominant as the top starters were 20 years ago compared to their peers. In the early 2000s, it was not uncommon to see a starting pitcher approach or even eclipse 10 WAR, though in the modern game, unless you're prime Jacob deGrom, that's pretty much impossible. Why? Because starting pitching as a whole has improved a lot and it's harder to stand out. To give you a sense of this, Joe Ryan was the 29th most valuable starter in the league in 2025 according to FWAR, and he was pretty good in 2025. Robert Person was the 29th most valuable pitcher in 2000. Nothing against Person, but I think Joe Ryan takes him here. So if the overall value isn't declining, then why does the starting pitcher is dying narrative feel so convincing? Because ultimately, the shape of starting pitching has changed more dramatically than the value of starting pitching. The days of one or two workhorse aces towering over the rest of the field, pitchers throwing 230 innings with elite command and lower velocity are most likely gone. And when the eye test loses those iconic, high-volume outliers, it creates the illusion that something valuable has been lost. But what's really happened is the gap between the best starters and the rest of the league has shrunk. If you judge modern starters by the standards of a totally different era with different velocity norms, different umpiring accuracy, different batter approaches, different developmental pipelines, of course they're going to look worse, but the game changes and the pitchers have changed with it. Starters today generate more swing and miss than ever, face hitters with more power than ever, and operate in a strike zone that is less forgiving than ever. The idea that they aren't as good only holds up if you ignore every other factor shaping the environment. the reality is that it's still one of the most valuable, irreplaceable, and strategically essential roles in the sport, meaning starting pitching isn't going away anytime soon. Thank you for watching, subscribe if you enjoyed, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.